HOA. Karen hates my Christmas lights. So I synced them to her tantrums. The first flicker was almost imperceptible. A hesitant pulse of light in the otherwise static expanse of my meticulously arranged Christmas display. I'd spent weeks, maybe even months, in the quiet corners of my mind, planning this year's iteration. It wasn't just about throwing up some tangled strands of colored bulbs anymore. It was an art form, a carefully orchestrated symphony of light and color designed to evoke the pure, unadulterated joy of the season. I'd started small years ago, with a simple string of white icicle lights dripping from the eaves of my modest suburban home. Each year, the ambition grew, the scope widened, the technology advanced. Now, my house was practically a beacon, a shimmering testament to holiday cheer, visible from at least 3 streets over, if the delighted honks and waving hands were anything to go by. This year's centerpiece was a custom-built mega tree, rising 20 feet into the December sky, adorned with thousands of individually addressable LEDs, capable of displaying an almost infinite palette of colors and patterns. It was controlled by a Raspberry Pi nestled snugly in a weatherproof box on my porch, humming with quiet processing power, ready to unleash its festive magic. I'd programmed elaborate light shows, synchronized to classic Christmas carols, intricate swirling patterns that mimicked falling snow, and even a countdown clock that ticked down the days, hours, and minutes until Christmas morning. The neighbors seemed to love it. Kids would drag their parents down the street after dinner, their faces illuminated by the dazzling spectacle, pointing and gasping with delight. Even the usually stoic Mr. Henderson from across the street cracked a smile and gave me a thumbs up as he walked his dog. Everyone, it seemed, appreciated the effort, the sheer exuberant joy I was trying to share. Except, of course, for Agnes. Agnes lived 2 doors down, a woman whose very presence seemed to suck the merriment out of the air. She was the self-appointed enforcer of neighborhood aesthetics, the unofficial HOA busybody, even though we didn't actually have an HOA. She just acted like we did, patrolling the streets with a hawk-like gaze, ready to pounce on any perceived infraction of her meticulously curated vision of suburban perfection. Her lawn was always impeccably manicured, a verdant carpet devoid of a single stray leaf. Her house was painted a bland beige hue, indistinguishable from every other house on the block, except for its utter lack of personality. And her Christmas decorations, if you could even call them that, consisted of a single pre-lit wreath hanging precariously on her front door, its plastic pine needles looking perpetually dusty and forlorn. I'd seen her watching me as I put up my lights, her lips pursed in a disapproving frown, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. I tried to smile and wave, hoping to diffuse any potential negativity, but she just turned her back and marched into her house, the door slamming shut with unnecessary force. I should have known then that trouble was brewing. The first sign came in the form of an anonymous note slipped into my mailbox, typed on plain white paper with no return address. "Your Christmas lights are excessive and gaudy," it read in stark Times New Roman font. "They are a blight on the neighborhood and detract from the peaceful enjoyment of our homes. Please remove them immediately." I scoffed, crumpled the note and tossed it in the recycling bin. Anonymous threats held no sway over me. I'd put up Christmas lights every year, and I wasn't about to stop now because some Grinch couldn't handle a little holiday cheer. But the note, as petty and ridiculous as it was, planted a seed of unease in my mind. I started to notice Agnes watching me more frequently, peering out from behind her curtains, her silhouette a dark, judgmental shape in her living room window. She'd even slow down her car as she drove past my house, her gaze fixed on my dazzling display, her expression a mixture of disgust and something else, something I couldn't quite decipher. But it felt personal. Then came the phone call. It was late in the evening, just as I was settling down to watch a movie. the warm glow of my Christmas lights bathing my living room in a festive hue. The phone rang, the caller ID displaying blocked number. I hesitated for a moment, then answered it anyway. "Hello," I said, my voice cautiously neutral. Silence. Then a voice, cold and sharp as shards of ice, cut through the quiet. "This is Agnes Miller," she announced, her tone devoid of any warmth or pleasantries. "We need to talk about your Christmas lights." My stomach clenched. I knew it. This was just the beginning. Her complaints initially were couched in the language of neighborhood aesthetics and property values. "Your lights are distracting," she'd said, her voice dripping with disdain, as if the very notion of colorful lights was an affront to her delicate sensibilities. "They're too bright, they're too flashy, they're tacky." She used that word a lot. Tacky. It was her favorite adjective to describe anything she deemed to be outside the narrow confines of her acceptable worldview. My Christmas lights, apparently, were the epitome of tackiness. "They disrupt the tranquility of the neighborhood," she continued, her voice rising in pitch, bordering on shrill. "People are trying to sleep, you know. Not everyone wants to be bombarded with your circus of lights." I tried to interject, to explain that the lights turned off at a reasonable hour, that they were programmed to dim after 10 p.m., that I'd even taken the initiative to point them slightly downwards to minimize light pollution. But she wouldn't let me get a word in edgewise. She steamrolled over my attempts at rational discourse, her complaints escalating in absurdity and vehemence. "And the colors," she exclaimed, as if the very spectrum of visible light was personally offensive to her. "All those garish reds and greens and blues, it's simply obnoxious. It looks like a cheap carnival, not a respectable suburban home." I resisted the urge to point out that Christmas lights were, by their very nature, supposed to be colorful and festive, that the whole point was to bring a little joy and light into the dark winter months. But arguing with Agnes was like arguing with a brick wall. She was impervious to reason, deaf to any perspective other than her own. "And the patterns," she went on, her voice now trembling with indignation. "All those flashing, swirling things. It's disorienting. It's giving me a headache." I almost laughed. Headache? From Christmas lights? It sounded ridiculous, but I could see in her eyes that she was genuinely serious. This wasn't just about aesthetics. It was something deeper, something more personal. It was like my Christmas lights were a direct affront to her very being, a symbol of everything she despised about the world. Joy, color, exuberance, anything that deviated from her rigid, beige-tinted view of normalcy. "Look," I said, finally managing to interrupt her tirade, my voice calm but firm. "I understand you don't like my lights, but I'm not breaking any laws. I'm not violating any neighborhood regulations, and most of my neighbors seem to enjoy them. I've put a lot of time and effort into this display, and I'm not going to take it down just because you personally find it tacky." The word hung in the air between us, a silent challenge. Agnes's face flushed crimson, her eyes narrowed to slits. "You think this is funny?" she hissed, her voice barely above a whisper but laced with a venom that made my skin crawl. "You think you can just do whatever you want, without any regard for your neighbors? You think you're so clever with your fancy lights?" "No," I said, my voice still calm but hardening with resolve. "I just want to celebrate Christmas. And if that bothers you, then maybe you should consider moving somewhere where Christmas doesn't exist." The silence that followed was thick and heavy, punctuated only by the gentle hum of my Christmas lights, casting dancing shadows on Agnes's contorted face. Then she spoke, her voice low and menacing. "You'll regret this," she said, each word dripping with malice. "You'll regret ever putting up those lights. I promise you." And with that, she turned on her heel and stormed back to her house, leaving me standing on my porch, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the December air. I knew then that this was far from over. This was just the beginning of a war over Christmas lights, and Agnes Miller was not going to back down. The threats started subtly, almost passive-aggressively. More anonymous notes in my mailbox, escalating in their tone from polite requests to veiled accusations. "Your lights are disturbing the wildlife," one note claimed, as if the local squirrels and birds were holding neighborhood meetings to complain about my festive display. "They are attracting unwanted attention," another warned, hinting at some unspecified danger lurking just beyond the edge of my brightly lit property. Then came the official-looking letter, bearing the ominous heading, "Neighborhood Aesthetics Committee, Notice of Violation." It was typed on what looked like official letterhead, but there was no actual committee, no official HOA, just Agnes, apparently, and her increasingly elaborate attempts to intimidate me. The letter listed a series of supposed violations, ranging from excessive brightness to unapproved color schemes to disruption of neighborhood harmony. It demanded that I remove my Christmas lights within 48 hours or face unspecified consequences. I laughed out loud when I read it. It was so absurd, so transparently petty and vindictive. But beneath the amusement, a flicker of annoyance began to grow. This was escalating beyond just petty complaints. Agnes was actively trying to harass and intimidate me, and she was clearly willing to go to ridiculous lengths to get her way. I decided to ignore the letter, to treat it with the contempt it deserved, but Agnes wasn't easily deterred. The next day, I found my trash cans tipped over in the street, their contents scattered across my lawn. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe some mischievous teenagers. But then I noticed Agnes watching me from her window, a smug, satisfied expression on her face. It was petty, childish, but it was also a clear escalation. She was escalating, and I needed to decide how to respond. I could back down, take down my lights, and appease the neighborhood Grinch. But that felt wrong. It felt like giving in to bullying, like letting her dictate how I decorated my own home. And besides, I genuinely enjoyed my Christmas lights. They brought me joy, and they brought joy to others. Why should I let Agnes Miller, a woman who seemed to derive pleasure from being miserable, take that away from me? No. I decided I wasn't going to back down. I wasn't going to let Agnes win. But I also knew that simply ignoring her wasn't going to make her go away. She was clearly determined to make my life miserable until I took down my lights. I needed a different approach. I needed to fight back. But how? I couldn't stoop to her level, engaging in petty vandalism or childish pranks. That wasn't my style. I needed something smarter, something more creative. And then, an idea began to form in my mind. An idea that was both audacious and slightly mischievous. An idea that would use my own Christmas lights against her in a way she could never have imagined. I smiled. It was time to fight fire with light. And I had just the technology to do it. My Raspberry Pi, my addressable LEDs, my coding skills. I could turn my Christmas lights into something more than just a festive display. I could turn them into a weapon of passive-aggressive retaliation. A weapon that would expose Agnes Miller for exactly who she was. A neighborhood tyrant, obsessed with control and determined to suck the joy out of everyone's lives. It was a risky plan, maybe even a little crazy. But I was tired of being harassed. I was tired of being bullied. And I was definitely tired of Agnes Miller and her ridiculous complaints about my Christmas lights. It was time to turn the tables. It was time to give Agnes a taste of her own medicine, but with lights. Lots and lots of very colorful, very synchronized, very reactive lights. The plan began to take shape in my mind, a digital tapestry of code and hardware, woven together with a healthy dose of mischievous intent. I started by researching voice recognition software, open source libraries that could analyze audio input and identify keywords, phrases, and even emotional tone. It was surprisingly sophisticated stuff, readily available online thanks to the burgeoning field of artificial intelligence. I found a Python library that seemed perfect for my needs, capable of transcribing speech in real time and even detecting sentiment. Positive, negative, neutral. The sentiment detection was key. I wanted my lights to react not just to Agnes's voice, but to the emotion behind her voice, to her anger, her frustration, her tantrums. Next, I needed to integrate the voice recognition software with my Christmas light controller. This was where my Raspberry Pi came in. It was already running the software that controlled my light shows, so adding another layer of functionality wasn't too difficult. I wrote a script that would listen to audio input from a microphone, a small USB microphone I plugged into the Raspberry Pi, and feed it to the voice recognition library. The script would then analyze the transcribed text and sentiment, and based on the results, trigger different light patterns on my mega tree and the rest of my display. For calm, neutral speech, the lights would remain static, displaying a gentle, festive glow. For positive sentiment like laughter or cheerful conversation, I could program them to display warm, welcoming colors and slow, gentle animations. But for negative sentiment, for anger, for raised voices, for tantrums, that's where things would get interesting. For tantrums, I decided, the lights would go wild. Flashing, strobing, cycling through the entire color spectrum at rapid speed. A visual representation of Agnes's inner turmoil, projected onto my house for the entire neighborhood to see. It was a bit theatrical, maybe even a little cruel. But after weeks of harassment and intimidation, I felt like Agnes deserved it. She wanted to control my Christmas lights? Fine. I'd let her control them, but not in the way she expected. The technical implementation took a few days of tinkering and coding. I had to calibrate the voice recognition software, fine-tune the sentiment detection, and create the different light patterns for each emotional state. I also had to make sure the system was robust and reliable, that it wouldn't trigger false positives or malfunction at a crucial moment. I tested it extensively using recordings of angry arguments and calm conversations, tweaking the parameters until I was satisfied with the results. Finally, it was ready. My Christmas lights were now voice-activated, emotion-reactive, and potentially very, very embarrassing for Agnes Miller. The microphone was discreetly placed on my porch, hidden amongst the inflatable snowmen and reindeer, positioned to pick up sounds from the street in Agnes's front yard. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it was there, listening, waiting, ready to capture Agnes's next outburst and translate it into a dazzling display of synchronized light and tantrum-induced chaos. I couldn't wait to see it in action. The anticipation was almost as exciting as Christmas itself. Almost. The first real test came sooner than I expected. It was a Saturday afternoon, a crisp, sunny day, perfect for holiday shopping or decorating the house. I was inside watching a Christmas movie when I heard a commotion outside. Raised voices, angry shouts, the unmistakable sound of Agnes Miller in full Karen mode. I peeked out the window, and there she was, standing on her front lawn, arms flailing, face contorted in rage, berating. Mr. Henderson. Poor Mr. Henderson. My usually stoic neighbor from across the street was standing there looking bewildered and slightly intimidated, holding a rake in his hands, as if he'd just been innocently raking leaves when Agnes had launched her verbal assault. I couldn't hear exactly what she was saying, but her tone was unmistakable. She was yelling, ranting, clearly in the throes of a full-blown tantrum. And then it happened. As Agnes's voice reached a particularly shrill crescendo, my Christmas lights sprang to life, not with the gentle, festive glow they usually displayed, but with a sudden burst of frenetic energy. The mega tree erupted in a chaotic swirl of colors, flashing red, blue, green, yellow, purple, white, all at once, in no discernible pattern. The icicle lights on the eaves started strobing wildly, mimicking lightning strikes. The inflatable snowman seemed to pulse with an inner light, as if it were about to explode. It was a dazzling, disorienting spectacle, completely out of sync with the peaceful suburban atmosphere, and it was all triggered by Agnes's voice. I watched from my window, a grin spreading across my face. It was working. My crazy plan was actually working. The lights were reacting to Agnes's tantrum in real time, amplifying her anger, broadcasting it to the entire neighborhood in a vibrant visual display. Mr. Henderson, initially startled by the sudden light show, turned towards my house, his eyes widening in surprise. Then, he looked back at Agnes, who was still ranting and raving, oblivious to the fact that her own voice was now controlling my Christmas lights. A slow smile spread across Mr. Henderson's face. He seemed to understand, to grasp the absurdity and the brilliance of the situation. He even let out a quiet chuckle, which seemed to further enrage Agnes, causing her voice to rise even higher in pitch, and the lights to flash even more frantically. It was a feedback loop of tantrum-induced light chaos. I couldn't contain my laughter. It was too perfect, too ridiculous, too utterly satisfying. Agnes, the self-appointed neighborhood tyrant, was unknowingly conducting her own personal light show, powered by her own anger, broadcast from my house for everyone to witness. The spectacle continued for a few minutes, until Agnes, apparently running out of steam, finally stormed back into her house, slamming the door behind her. As soon as her voice disappeared, the lights calmed down, reverting back to their gentle, festive glow. Mr. Henderson shook his head, still chuckling, and gave me a discreet thumbs up before resuming his leaf raking. I retreated back inside, feeling a surge of exhilaration. It was just the beginning, I knew. But it was a glorious beginning. Agnes had no idea what was happening. No idea that her own tantrums were now being amplified and broadcast by my Christmas lights. And I intended to keep it that way, for as long as possible. The game was on. The next few days were filled with a delicious sense of anticipation. I waited, almost eagerly, for Agnes to unleash her next tantrum, knowing that my lights were ready to respond, to transform her anger into a public spectacle. It wasn't long before opportunity knocked, or rather, shouted. It was a Tuesday evening, trash collection night. I'd put my bins out at the curb, neatly lined up, as always. Agnes apparently had different ideas about bin placement. I heard her voice before I saw her, a shrill, accusatory tone echoing through the quiet evening air. I peeked out the window again, and there she was, standing in the street, hands on her hips, glaring at my trash bins. Apparently, they were too close to the curb, or blocking the sidewalk, or some other equally ridiculous infraction of her self-imposed neighborhood rules. She was yelling at the trash collectors, two burly guys in orange vests, who looked thoroughly unimpressed by her tirade. They were just trying to do their job, and Agnes was making it as difficult as possible. As Agnes's voice reached a fever pitch, the lights on my house began to react. Slowly at first, a subtle flickering, then gradually escalating into a full-blown light show. The trash collectors, initially oblivious to the lights, started to notice as they became more intense. They exchanged confused glances, then looked towards my house, then back at Agnes, who was still ranting and raving, completely unaware of the spectacle she was creating. One of the trash collectors, a young guy with a shaved head and a mischievous grin, nudged his partner and pointed towards my house. They both started to laugh, quietly at first, then louder, as the lights flashed and strobed in sync with Agnes's increasingly frantic pronouncements about trash bin placement and neighborhood decorum. Agnes, finally noticing the laughter, turned her attention from the bewildered trash collectors to my house, her eyes widening in disbelief as she took in the chaotic light display. She seemed to realize, for the first time, that something was different, that my lights were behaving strangely, reacting to something. She looked around, her gaze darting from my house to the trash collectors to the street, her face a mask of confusion and dawning suspicion. Then, her eyes landed on my porch, specifically on the inflatable snowman, strategically positioned near the microphone. A look of understanding, mixed with horror and outrage, spread across her face. She put it together. She realized that her own voice, her own tantrum, was controlling my Christmas lights. Her mouth dropped open. She stopped yelling, mid-sentence. Her voice abruptly cut off. The lights, sensing the sudden silence, began to calm down. The frantic flashing slowing to a gentle pulse, then fading back to a static, festive glow. Agnes stood there, frozen, staring at my house, her face pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of anger and humiliation. The trash collectors, still chuckling, finished their route and drove off, leaving Agnes standing alone in the street, bathed in the soft, mocking glow of my Christmas lights, the lights that had just publicly exposed her latest outburst to the entire neighborhood. I watched from my window, a wave of satisfaction washing over me. She knew. She finally knew. And I had a feeling, a very strong feeling, that things were about to get very interesting. Very interesting indeed. The realization hit Agnes hard. I could see it in her eyes, the dawning comprehension, the slow burn of humiliation and rage. She stood there for a long moment, frozen in place, as if trying to process the impossible, the utterly absurd reality that her own tantrums were now being turned into a public spectacle powered by my Christmas lights. Then she moved. Not back to her house, as I might have expected, but towards mine. She marched across the street, her steps deliberate and heavy, her face set in a grim, determined expression. I braced myself. This was it. The confrontation I'd been anticipating. The showdown between Agnes Miller and her nemesis, my synchronized, tantrum-reactive Christmas lights. She reached my lawn and stopped, standing directly in front of my porch, staring up at the microphone, the silent witness to her vocal outbursts. She seemed to be trying to intimidate it, to somehow silence it with the sheer force of her gaze. Then, she turned her attention to my front door. She took a deep breath, as if gathering her courage, and rang the doorbell. Reluctantly, I opened the door. Agnes stood there, framed in the doorway, her face flushed, her eyes narrowed, her body trembling with barely suppressed anger. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low and tight, each word clipped and precise. "Yes, Agnes," I said, my voice calm and neutral, inviting her inside. "I believe we do." I led her into my living room, which was still bathed in the warm, festive glow of my Christmas lights, now displaying a gentle, swirling snowflake pattern. She stood in the middle of the room, surveying the scene with a mixture of disgust and disbelief. "This is unbelievable," she said, finally breaking the silence, her voice laced with indignation. You've rigged your Christmas lights to react to my voice?" "Something like that," I said, trying to suppress a smile. "I call it interactive art." "Interactive art?" she scoffed, rolling her eyes. "It's childish. It's petty. It's harassment." "Harassment?" I raised an eyebrow, feigning innocence. "Agnes, I'm just displaying Christmas lights. It's a Christmas tradition. If you happen to express yourself vocally in their vicinity and they happen to react, well, that's just a coincidence, isn't it?" She glared at me, her nostrils flaring. "Don't play games with me," she hissed. "I know what you're doing. You're doing this to make fun of me, to humiliate me, to get back at me for complaining about your lights." "Agnes," I said, my voice softening slightly, trying to adopt a more conciliatory tone. "Honestly, it started as a bit of a joke. I was frustrated with your complaints and, well, I'm a tech guy. I like to tinker, and the idea just popped into my head. I didn't expect it to escalate like this." "Escalate?" she repeated, her voice rising in pitch again. "You think this is just escalating? You've turned my neighborhood into a laughingstock. Everyone is going to think I'm crazy." "Agnes," I said, taking a step closer to her, my voice now genuinely sympathetic. Maybe if you didn't tantrum so much in public, the lights wouldn't react so dramatically." The words hung in the air between us, a stark, uncomfortable truth. Agnes fell silent, her anger momentarily deflated by the sheer, undeniable logic of my statement. For a moment, just a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something else in her eyes, something beyond anger and indignation, something vulnerable, but it was fleeting, quickly replaced by a renewed surge of resentment. "You think this is my fault?" she said, her voice regaining its edge. "You think I'm the one who's acting crazy? You're the one who's rigged your house like some kind of circus freak show. You're the one who's disrupting the peace and quiet of this neighborhood." The confrontation reached its peak, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. Agnes stood there, trembling with rage, her accusations echoing in the warm, festive glow of my now ironically cheerful Christmas lights. "Agnes," I said, trying to maintain a calm, reasonable tone, even as my own patience started to wear thin. "I'm not trying to disrupt the peace and quiet. I'm just trying to enjoy Christmas. And yes, maybe my methods are a little unconventional, but you have to admit it's kind of ingenious, isn't it?" She stared at me, her eyes narrowed, as if trying to decipher whether I was genuinely insane or just incredibly arrogant. "Ingenious?" she scoffed. "It's pathetic. It's a pathetic attempt to get attention, to make yourself feel important." "That's not fair, Agnes," I said, my voice hardening slightly. "I'm not doing this for attention. I'm doing this because you wouldn't leave me alone. You started this, Agnes. You started complaining about my lights. You sent me anonymous notes. You tipped over my trash cans. You've been harassing me for weeks just because you don't like my Christmas decorations. And now, you're complaining because I found a creative way to respond?" The truth hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Agnes had been the aggressor, the instigator, the one who had escalated this petty neighborhood dispute into a full-blown war of Christmas lights. And now, she was facing the consequences of her own actions, literally illuminated by the very source of her initial complaints. She fell silent again, her anger momentarily eclipsed by a flicker of self-awareness. Maybe, just maybe, she was starting to realize the absurdity of her own behavior, the ridiculousness of her obsession with controlling my Christmas lights. But then, the moment passed. Her face hardened again, her eyes blazing with renewed indignation. "So what do you want?" she demanded, her voice sharp and accusatory. "What do you want me to do? Apologize? Beg you to take down your monstrosity?" "No, Agnes," I said, shaking my head. "I don't want you to apologize. And I'm definitely not taking down my lights. I just want you to stop. Stop harassing me. Stop complaining. Stop trying to control what I do on my own property. Just leave me alone." "Leave you alone?" she repeated, her voice incredulous. "You expect me to just ignore this, to pretend that you're not turning my life into a living hell with your crazy lights?" "Agnes," I sighed, feeling a wave of weariness wash over me. "It's Christmas. It's supposed to be a time of joy and peace and goodwill. Can't we just call a truce? Can't we just agree to disagree about my Christmas lights and try to be civil to each other?" She stared at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she let out a short, bitter laugh. "Civil?" she said, shaking her head. "You think we can be civil? After what you've done? After you've turned me into a neighborhood joke?" "Agnes," I pleaded, my voice now tinged with desperation. "I didn't want to turn you into a joke. I just wanted you to stop harassing me. And maybe if you can learn to laugh at yourself a little bit instead of getting so angry all the time, maybe things would be different." The words hung in the air, a final desperate attempt to reach some kind of understanding, some kind of resolution. But Agnes wasn't listening. Her anger had consumed her, blinding her to any possibility of reason or compromise. She turned to leave, her back stiff, her shoulders squared, her face a mask of cold, implacable fury. "This isn't over," she said, her voice low and menacing as she reached the doorway. "This is far from over." And with that, she stormed out of my house, leaving me standing alone in my living room, bathed in the flickering glow of my Christmas lights, feeling a deep sense of foreboding. I knew she was right. This wasn't over. It was just the beginning of the final act, the climax of our Christmas light war. And I had a feeling it was going to be explosive, literally. The final confrontation came on Christmas Eve during the neighborhood's annual holiday block party. It was a tradition, a potluck gathering of neighbors, caroling, hot cocoa, festive cheer, the whole suburban Christmas package. This year it was being held at Mr. Henderson's house, the largest property on the block, with a spacious backyard perfect for hosting a crowd. Everyone was there, families with kids, couples, even old Mrs. Gable from down the street, bundled up in her warmest winter coat. Everyone, that is, except Agnes. I hadn't seen her since our tense conversation a few days earlier. I'd hoped, maybe naively, that she would stay away from the block party, that she would avoid any further public confrontations. But I should have known better. Agnes Miller was not one to back down, not one to let go of a grudge, especially not a grudge involving Christmas lights and perceived neighborhood slights. The party was in full swing, carols playing softly from outdoor speakers, kids running around excitedly, the air filled with the scent of pine needles and hot chocolate. My Christmas lights, now set to a gentle, festive display of swirling snowflakes and soft pastel colors, were casting a warm glow over my house and yard, contributing to the overall festive atmosphere. I was mingling with neighbors, chatting, laughing, trying to enjoy the holiday spirit, even with the looming shadow of Agnes and her unresolved Christmas light grievances hanging over my head. Then I saw her. She appeared suddenly, as if materializing out of the darkness, standing at the edge of Mr. Henderson's backyard, her silhouette stark against the festive lights. She was dressed in a long, dark coat, her face pale and set, her eyes fixed on me with a look of cold, unwavering determination. A hush fell over the party as people noticed her presence, as the festive chatter died down, replaced by an uneasy silence. Agnes walked slowly into the backyard, her gaze sweeping over the crowd, her expression a mixture of disdain and righteous indignation. She stopped in the center of the yard, directly in front of Mr. Henderson's makeshift stage, where a group of carolers was just preparing to sing. "Excuse me," she said, her voice cutting through the silence, loud and clear, amplified by the sudden quiet. "I have something to say." Everyone turned to look at her, a mixture of curiosity and apprehension in their eyes. Mr. Henderson, looking flustered, stepped forward. "Agnes," he said, his voice conciliatory, "what are you doing here? We're just having a little Christmas party." "I know what you're doing," Agnes interrupted, her voice rising in pitch. "You're all celebrating. You're all pretending that everything is fine, but it's not fine. It's not fine at all." She paused, taking a deep breath, and then she launched into her tirade. "This neighborhood has been ruined," she declared, her voice trembling with anger. "Ruined by vulgarity, by tackiness, by people who have no respect for decency, for standards." She gestured dramatically towards my house, her arm outstretched, pointing like an accusing finger at my brightly lit display. "And it's all because of him," she exclaimed, her voice reaching a crescendo, her eyes blazing with fury as she pointed directly at me. "Because of his obscene Christmas lights, his gaudy, flashing monstrosity that is polluting our neighborhood and driving down our property values." As she spoke, as her voice rose in anger and indignation, my Christmas lights began to react, slowly at first, a subtle flicker, then a more pronounced pulsing, then a full-blown eruption of light and color. The mega tree started flashing wildly, the icicle lights strobing frantically, the inflatable decorations pulsing and glowing with chaotic energy. The lights were responding to Agnes's tantrum, amplifying her anger, broadcasting her outburst to the entire neighborhood in a dazzling, embarrassing display. And everyone was watching. Everyone was witnessing Agnes Miller's Christmas Eve meltdown, played out in real time, illuminated by my synchronized, tantrum-reactive Christmas lights. The lights reached a fever pitch, a chaotic symphony of flashing colors and strobing patterns, mirroring the escalating intensity of Agnes's rant. Her voice, fueled by righteous indignation and years of pent-up neighborhood grievances, soared above the festive carols and polite chatter, dominating the block party with its shrill, accusatory tone. "He thinks he's so clever," she shrieked, her face contorted with rage, pointing directly at me, her finger trembling with barely controlled fury. "He thinks he can just do whatever he wants without any consequences. He thinks he can turn my life into a living hell with his ridiculous lights. And we're all just supposed to stand here and applaud." Her words were slurring together now, her sentences becoming disjointed, her anger threatening to overwhelm her completely. The lights, sensing her emotional disintegration, responded in kind, becoming even more frenetic, more chaotic, more unhinged. The mega tree pulsed with a blinding white light, then exploded into a rainbow of flashing colors, cycling through the spectrum at dizzying speed. The icicle lights flickered like faulty neon signs, casting erratic shadows across the faces of the stunned neighbors. Even the inflatable snowman seemed to shudder and convulse, as if possessed by some kind of festive, tantrum-fueled demon. The children, initially fascinated by the sudden light show, started to cry, overwhelmed by the intensity and the sheer, unadulterated chaos of it all. Parents rushed to comfort them, shielding their eyes from the flashing lights, their faces a mixture of concern and bewildered amusement. Mr. Henderson, looking increasingly distressed, tried to intervene, stepping towards Agnes, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Agnes, please," he pleaded, his voice barely audible above the din of Agnes's rant and the flashing lights. "Calm down, you're upsetting everyone." But Agnes was beyond calming down. She was lost in her own vortex of anger and self-righteousness, oblivious to the chaos she was creating, to the public spectacle she was becoming. "No!" she screamed, her voice cracking with emotion. "I won't calm down. I won't be silent. Someone has to stand up to this tyranny of tackiness. Someone has to say enough is enough." And then it happened. In the midst of her rant, in the crescendo of her tantrum, in the blinding flash of my synchronized Christmas lights, Agnes Miller tripped. She stumbled backwards, her heels catching on the uneven ground of Mr. Henderson's backyard, her arms flailing wildly as she lost her balance. For a moment, she teetered precariously on the edge of disaster, her face a mask of surprise and terror. Then, with a gasp, she fell. She tumbled backwards, landing with a resounding thud on the ground, her long, dark coat billowing around her like a shroud. Silence descended upon the block party, broken only by the gentle hum of my Christmas lights, now slowly, almost mockingly, fading back to their peaceful, festive glow. Everyone stared at Agnes, lying motionless on the ground, her face pale, her eyes closed. The laughter died in their throats. The amusement faded from their faces, replaced by a collective gasp of shock and concern. The Christmas carols stopped playing. The children's cries subsided. The festive cheer evaporated, leaving behind a chilling silence, broken only by the soft, mocking whisper of the wind and the fading glow of my Christmas lights. Christmas Eve, and Agnes Miller had finally, dramatically, and very publicly, fallen. And my Christmas lights, synced to her tantrums, had been the soundtrack to her downfall. The silence hung heavy in the air, thick with unspoken emotions, a mixture of shock, disbelief, and a strange, uncomfortable sense of vindication. Agnes lay still on the ground, her dark coat a stark contrast to the snow-dusted lawn, her stillness amplifying the sudden quiet that had descended upon the block party. People rushed forward, a wave of concerned neighbors converging on the fallen figure. Mr. Henderson was the first to reach her, kneeling beside her, his voice filled with worry. "Agnes? Agnes, are you all right?" He gently shook her shoulder, his touch hesitant, unsure. Agnes stirred, a faint groan escaping her lips. Her eyes fluttered open, blinking slowly, as if trying to make sense of her surroundings. She looked up at the faces peering down at her, a confused, disoriented expression on her face. What happened?" she mumbled, her voice weak and groggy. "You fell, Agnes," Mr. Henderson explained gently. "You tripped. Are you hurt?" Agnes slowly sat up, wincing slightly, her hand reaching up to touch her head. I don't know," she said, her voice still weak, but regaining some of its familiar sharpness. My ankle hurts. And my head." Someone offered her a hand, helping her to her feet. She stood unsteadily, swaying slightly, her face pale and drawn. The festive cheer of the block party was completely gone, replaced by an atmosphere of awkward concern and subdued tension. The Christmas carols remained silent. The hot cocoa went cold in mugs. The laughter was replaced by hushed whispers. The spotlight, however unintentional, was now firmly on Agnes, the fallen Karen, the neighborhood tyrant who had finally tripped, both literally and figuratively, in front of everyone. And my Christmas lights, the source of her ire, the instrument of her public humiliation, were still glowing softly in the background, a silent, shimmering testament to the absurdity of the whole situation. I watched from the edge of the crowd, feeling a complex mix of emotions. Relief, certainly. Satisfaction, maybe a little. But also a strange sense of emptiness. The war was over. Agnes had been defeated, her tantrums exposed, her authority undermined, her public image shattered, all thanks to my synchronized Christmas lights. I had won, but somehow victory felt hollow. The joy I had anticipated, the triumphant satisfaction I had imagined, was missing. Instead, there was just a quiet sense of anticlimactic resolution, a feeling that the whole thing had been a bit much, a bit petty, a bit un-Christmas-like. Agnes, supported by Mr. Henderson and a few other concerned neighbors, slowly made her way back to her house, her limp noticeable, her head bowed, her silence more eloquent than any angry tirade. The block party, effectively over, slowly began to disperse, neighbors murmuring to each other, casting furtive glances in my direction, their expressions a mixture of sympathy for Agnes, amusement at the spectacle, and perhaps a little bit of awe at my unconventional methods. I turned off my Christmas lights. The sudden darkness felt strangely appropriate, a symbolic ending to the Christmas light war, a quiet closing of the curtain on the Agnes Miller saga. The neighborhood was silent, the festive glow extinguished, the only light coming from the distant street lamps and the faint glimmer of snow on the ground. Christmas Eve and the neighborhood Grinch had finally been silenced. But the silence somehow felt less like peace and more like something else, something quieter, something deeper, something more complicated.